I'm doing this in slightly reverse order, the interesting intro and all that. But there was a kind of a message, and I am going to go back to this sort of charming intro, and it's part of what I mean by the slightly biographical story of this title. It's my perspective on a period of time back in the day and where we are now with respect to a pretty impressive set of technologies and topics around genomics. But when I say the older I get, I don't mean that in a strictly chronological way, but in a biographical way. The more I sort of work through my own story, the more I appreciate that anything I've done or been involved in has really been a result of people, of particular people at particular times making particular contributions. I mean, I didn't even recognize Rich Schreiner when I walked in, and I sort of looked at him, and then he came up to me and said, "Hi, Eric, I'm Rich Schreiner from Pediatrics." It's like saying, "Hi, I'm Jesus Christ. Maybe you're familiar with me." Some people think that that's who it is. But this, for those who weren't here back in the day, you'll see later that there are more of them, but there were some fairly influential people. And I would say, but for them at a particular time, a lot of the stuff that Peter just mentioned, including my coming to IU, would not have happened. And that is including people like Miles Brand, a former president, who was quite visionary and risk-taking in thinking about something odd like bioethics on a different campus. Our much beloved former IUPUI Chancellor Jerry Bepko, who just passed away recently, who was quite influential both behind the scenes or in the room next to the room where things happened. Of course, Craig Brader and Ora Peskovitz, I can't say enough about their kindness and their creativity and thinking. You may not know all the other people below them, but Herman Satkamp was a dean of liberal arts, quite progressive. And in fact, Herman was the one who called me while I was still working in Washington, D.C. and said, "You don't know me, but a friend of yours named Jonathan Moreno told me I should call you." So it's all about people. Angela McBride, just a spectacular dean of nursing. Norm Lefstein was the dean of the law school. And we've already mentioned my good friend Bill Tierney, who's at the back. You may not know the Yoda-like figure on the right. Some of you will know the Yoda-like figure. That's Dr. Edmund Pellegrino. And Dr. Pellegrino, in addition to being one of my mentors at Georgetown and a legend and true founding father in the field of bioethics, unbeknownst to me, was asked by, and Bill may have been on this committee, he's on every committee known to IU, to come, I think, in the mid-2000s and do a site visit on this campus and essentially assess its capacity for establishing some kind of bioethics activity. And the way that Pellegrino told me that he told IU is, you would be crazy to not do something here. You've got the largest medical school in the country. You've got all of this stuff going on. Nobody knows about it. The sort of joke about Indiana, flyover state, and all the rest of it. But Pellegrino, who established 2 medical schools, was a medical advisor to the Pope, was the former president of Catholic University. I mean, he was the real deal, and practically invented the field of medical humanities from a physician's perspective. And he sort of read IU the Riot Act and said, you would be crazy if you didn't do something. So in many ways, I'm just the product of a much longer conversation that was held by people who were prepared to take certain risks at a certain time. So that's why I slightly humorously, but wanted you to know why I began with that. So this was the title that Peter and I worked out, a little bit of looking in the past and looking to the future. I do want you to know a few things. I won't read the whole slide, but I do a bit of work for the OECD. I'm very honored. I'm going to get a small stipend for this visit. But I have a number of affiliations nodding only at the Council of Canadian Academies, a mouthful that no one ever says correctly, but a few other academic affiliations, and the standard disclosures that these are my words. They may agree with them. I hope they do, but this is essentially all me. I love this quote from Mark Twain, because we spend a lot of time thinking that we're looking in the past, and we have this kind of rose-colored view of it. It's always better back then, whatever back then was. Or we say we should, in the case of something like pandemic preparedness, Chad, I'm looking at you, buddy. Let's learn the lessons of the past and make sure we don't repeat them. It's a tiresome phrase. I think it should be retired, because I don't think anybody knows what it means to learn a lesson. They don't know what the lessons are, who's authorized to teach them, how we know when they have been learned, and when the curriculum needs to be revised. So, I wouldn't mind declaring a moratorium until people understand what the hell they mean when they say we're going to learn from the past and not repeat those failures. And of course, we'll absolutely recognize and repeat easily all of the successes. Good luck, but I don't think that's been happening. This captures, for me, on the other hand, a kind of, we aren't starting from scratch every time. And those of us who don't remember, I'm not using the quote about it, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. That's not the point. It's that this is all part of a story. And I just kind of entered the story at a particular point in time, with a particular set of opportunities, at what I think was a quite exciting time for the IU Medical School, for the field of genomics, and I would say for the field of bioethics. I know that humans like to have origin stories that start at a particular time, and it's very hard to get agreement on what the origin story was for a field like genomics. Clearly, there has been genetics research and genomics for quite some time. This is a slightly, why does that say talking Eric Meslin covering up Bill Clinton's words? Technology is supposed to be our friend. Can I move this? Philosopher. That's the extent. Now, I did make all these slides, so that's also the extent of my ability. What you're seeing here is a little bit of a complicated slide, but hopefully if you've read a bit over my shoulder, you'll know what it is. On June the 26th, 2000, Bill Clinton convened about 120 people in the East Room of the White House. I was fortunate enough to be one of them, where he brought Francis Collins, pictured on Clinton's left or your right, and Craig Venter, pictured on his right, your left, to announce that the rough draft of the human genome had been sequenced, the rough draft. This was a diplomatic, a détente, because the sequence hadn't been finished, but there had been a parallel, quite public competition / fight between the public genome project led by Collins et al., not only at NHGRI, but elsewhere at several important sites around the country and around the world. Meanwhile, Craig Venter, running the organization called Celera Genomics, using a different method of trying to figure out the location and alphabetic order of the genome, was getting very close. And there's a much longer story that we don't have time to tell, but an agreement was reached that on this day they would both show up in the East Room. Tony Blair was on a big screen behind them from number 10 Downing Street, where they chose to say, this is the day. It could have been the day before, it could have been the day after. There's nothing magical about the day as a date. But what was quite magical, irrespective of your feelings about Bill Clinton, I would urge you to YouTube this announcement, where even to this day, it sort of sends a little bit of a chill up my spine, where he said, nearly 2 centuries ago in this room, on this floor, Thomas Jefferson and a trusted aide spread out a magnificent map, a map Jefferson had long prayed he would get to see in his lifetime. He was, of course, speaking about Lewis and Clark coming back from the West, and the foundation slide, foundation background for this slide is part of the report from Lewis and Clark. Clinton had some excellent speechwriters, as I think you can tell. He also had a gift for rhetoric and public speaking. And when he said, "We're here to see, without a doubt, the most wondrous map ever produced by mankind, the first survey of the entire human genome," it's kind of hard to top that using the rhetorical tools of metaphor and analogy and simile to be able to say that happened then. I'm just part of a long chain of chief executives that have welcomed science into this room. Like, there's a lot to unpack. I'm not going to do all of it in a slide. The map of the opening of the West was life-changing for the United States, and arguably the map, which you'll see, this is the picture of the rough draft underneath the Nature, Science, and Time magazine covers, was arguably of equivalent impact at that time. Lots more happened after that date. Arbitrary dates like the first working draft and then the completed draft. So these were, in a sense, marketing strategies for reasons unrelated to, we're just announcing the publication of something we found in an academic journal. This had much more going on. It had international diplomacy. It was a movie. I mean, there were behind the scenes fights about who would stand on which side of Clinton at that meeting. Who would appear on Time magazine in front and behind? Who would be publishing in Nature and Science? All of this was negotiated. This didn't go through regular peer review. Ari Petrinos, then the director of the Department of Energy's Genome Project, allegedly engaged in the equivalent of what we called pizza shuttle diplomacy, where he invited Collins' inventor to his home in Gaithersburg, Maryland, over pizza over several weekends to try and hash this out, right? So in some ways, this slide says more than just what's on it, and I would love to say a lot more, but I would say for me, it was a pivot point in how I thought about the role of science, ethics, and policy to see, two world leaders at the same time, a room full of everyone. Jim Watson was in the front row, and if you watch the video as often as you want, you will see Clinton walk in, turn his head to Collins, and Collins will go like that. And then in the middle of Clinton's introductions, he says, "It's really nice to see Jim Watson," having just asked Collins, "Where's Jim Watson?" That's how sort of good Clinton was on his feet, but also how important it was after he recognized all the diplomats and all the whatevers and the whomevers. I was basically sitting sort of where Matt Rotelli was, maybe a couple of rows back, maybe where Chad is in that room. It was no bigger than this. And it was an electric meeting. And obviously you can tell it still had an impact on me. Come on. Was it like because I took too long and it walked up? Okay, fine. Just using the dipping into the Clinton files for a second. This is a slide that reflects also many things going on at one time. The topic of embryonic stem cells became another accelerant in the public discussion of science and genomics. It was the result of two different laboratories in two different places, in Wisconsin and Hopkins, being able to identify and derive embryonic stem cells and embryonic germ cells in private laboratories, because there was a prohibition on using any federal funds to conduct research on a human embryo. So people like Jamie Thompson at the University of Wisconsin had a duplicate lab across the street where everything in that lab, from buying the pencils to everything else were paid for with private funds, because if he had conducted the same research on campus at the University of Wisconsin, he would have violated federal regs. So fascinating little story behind a story. But Science Magazine in December 1999 awarded stem cells the breakthrough of the year. I'm not sure if you can see it very, very clearly. That led to a number of other things. Clinton asked the National Bioethics Advisory Commission to work on this. Like, oh my God. It also worked on Dolly, minor matter, a little cloned sheep. But this became something, this was a big deal, like a bigger deal, for all of the arguments about what the benefits of stem cells would be if properly used. Their potential was literally endless. They were pluripotent, or as the Brits say, pluripotent, which means that they can evolve into any cell in the body. I mean, talk about a wonder machine. NBAC weighed in with its own work, and what I've highlighted to you here, one is the letter to the president. Always fun to write a letter to the president. Like, that's a neat homework assignment. Make sure you don't have any spelling errors. But in NBAC, as we called it, made an observation, which I think is the first time that the public really understood how difficult bioethics was when applied to public policy. We said, although wide agreement exists that human embryos deserve respect, and I put it in red so you wouldn't miss it, as a form of human life, there is disagreement both on the form such respect should take and on the level of protection owed at different stages of embryonic development. It took a long time to negotiate 18 commissioners to get that language. That was not just, let's come up with something. The phrase, as a form of human life, was challenging. If you say it's a moral person, then you're taking a position. If you say it's a blob of nothing, you're taking a moral position. It's not a rock. It's not a tree. It's something. Never mind the fact that, tangential comment, when NIH knew that we were starting on this project, they sent a number of interns off to the National Library of Medicine and said, can you give us a definition for when an embryo becomes a fetus? So we know, because there are prohibitions on embryo research, and there are different prohibitions on fetal tissue transplantation research. Like, what is this? I'm sort of looking at Rich, because if anyone in the room would know about developmental biology, and it would be him. Maybe there's other people in the room. I don't know. Guess what? They couldn't find one. Why? Because this is life. It doesn't have a date. On Thursday, after 6 days and 6 hours, it somehow transits from one thing to another. That's really hard to regulate. So there are a lot of things going on with this admission about the moral status of the human embryo, which wasn't just a philosophic question. It had implications for regulation and federal funding. Meanwhile, George Bush's Bioethics Commission looked at this same topic a few years later. And I'm going to say, surprise, surprise, but I don't mean that humorously. Unsurprisingly, they came to a similar, albeit slightly more dramatic conclusion, which you also may have read. We still have a long way to go before stem cell-based therapies can be developed and made available. For now, neither side to the debate seems close to persuading the other of the truth it thinks it sees. I mean, that's epistemology in a bioethics paper. The truth of, like, this is kind of fun if you're in the nerd game of trying to unpack policy, but it is a nightmare if you're trying to make a recommendation to the President of the United States and Congress about what to do. So that's sort of another chapter in my journey. That report was sent on September 7th, 1999. And then, a couple of years passed, and then this happened. Well, what's the this? The this is that the Lilly Endowment awarded Indiana University School of Medicine $105 million, the largest grant in its history. I think I have that right, Bill. It's 105 million, maybe. It's a big chunk. Never before given. As I say, I was at Lilly yesterday, courtesy of Matt Ratelli, and I got to, if you haven't been there, there's a museum that you can see all about the family history of the Lillys and what they were all about, and quite interesting. And one of the things we know is that Colonel Eli, the founder, was very specific about how the endowment funds would be used. It was to be used for public goods, religion and education and public works and libraries and community. It was not to be about health. Now, whether I haven't read a good biography of him yet, or haven't read a biography, good or bad, if you know of one, I'd like to read it, whether he was thinking about the moral implications of a perceived conflict of interest, if the money they made from drug development should be used to fund drug risk, I don't know. But apparently the story, and I'm happy to be corrected, was we shouldn't do that. And yet they gave $105 million. 2 points. Why did they do it? And why was it 105? Like, that seems like a weird number. Well, they did it because, and they're not here, some of the Jedi Knights that I showed you on the first slide, people like Miles Brand and Craig Brader and Ora Peskovitz, I would say persuaded, first time I've ever used this sentence, so it may not come out right, persuaded the Lilly Endowment of the truth it thought it saw, there I try to combine things, of the value of investing in Indiana, that this large grant would be. It's not give us a bunch of money and you can, design some medicines, or you can pay for some medical students, or you can build some cool buildings. It was a much larger vision than that. And I say bravo and many thanks to the Lilly Endowment for doing that. Why was it 105 million? Some of you already know this story, but in the early days, in fact, the beginning of the Genome Project, when Jim Watson went to Congress and said, if you give me $3 billion, I will map and sequence I will lead a program that will map and sequence the human genome in 10 years. Bearing in mind that we didn't know how to map or sequence the genome when he said it, but it was Jim Watson. And he said to Congress, and they're like, okay. He said, but there's one thing that I do want to ask for. I want to make sure that the ethical, legal, and social implications of this work are also funded. So I am requesting that 3% of the federal appropriation to the Genome Project go to ethical, legal, and social implications. Not an amount, 3%. And of course, virtually in every year except the Bush administration, the NIH appropriation went up. So it was a brilliant strategy. 3% of a larger number is more money every year. It was adjusted to 5% when Collins came in. So the ELSI program, which Peter kindly reminded you that I led for 3 years, was the steward of this 5% of the NHGRI budget, giving extramural grants. So let's just say that I was still working at NBAC when I got a call from Craig Brader and said, we're thinking of starting a Center for Bioethics and we'd like you to visit. And one of the ways we're thinking of funding it is through this large Indiana Genomics initiative that has this big grant that we want to submit to the Lilly Endowment. What do you think about that? And I said, I've got a cool idea. Why don't you ask them for 5% for bioethics? There's a history. It's the ELSI program. We'll try that. So it's $105 million because there was $100 million for the boring genomic stuff, and there was $5 million for bioethics. Okay, and included, this is the press release that listed bioethics as one of the 6 key components of the initiative, which is a non-trivial matter. This wasn't, we're going to do all these cool things, and then we're also going to make sure there's some ethics discussed. This was a central component, a key component of the overall initiative. And I think a lesson that was probably not, I don't mean learned, I don't think fully appreciated over time as an institutional strategy for how you embed ethics into what you're doing. Yes, you should have programs. You should have centers for bioethics. I keep saying Lily because Matt's sitting here. You can have programs, you can have committees, you can have all kinds of things, but the risk is always if you silo it into something over there in the corner, it will always be seen as that thing over there in the corner. But the reason that those Jedi Knights were so impressive is that whether they were in liberal arts or nursing or medicine or law, they all recognize the value proposition for IU. And I'm forever grateful for that. This is sort of a bit of a history. Again, Tierney may, well, and Stan may as well. This is could be a trivia test for the folks in the room. The bottom right picture, which may not look so good in the lights here, is the Radebush VA Center, which was the first home of the IU Center for Bioethics. We were in the basement, right next to where the weekly burning of biological materials occurred. Every Tuesday. It was disgusting. But we had some nice space. Charlie Clark was there to help us figure out our way around. And then eventually, when the magnificent HITS building was built, the Center for Bioethics enjoyed a spot on the third floor. Again, making a very important political statement. We weren't just a little group. We were on the same floor as biostatistics. Maybe because we both started with bio, I don't know. But Children's Health Services research was there. Population Genomics was there. A bunch of others. And the idea was the common coffee pot on steroids. You know, you're bumping into people who are doing health services research and pediatrics and drug development and biostats, and you became a known quantity. You weren't those strange people over there who, I don't know, run the IRB or something that is often so narrowly associated with what bioethics is. This was a research organization, every bit as important and relevant, built into a grant, same criteria for success, by the way. This is not a charity. You got work to do. It allowed us to I didn't even know that Rich was going to be here. It allowed us to have conversations with others who said, we're interested in that too. Why don't we recruit a pediatric bioethicist? Why don't we? Why don't we try a number of things? So it generated, as a case study, a lot of activity. I'm, again, using the rule of not putting too many things on a PowerPoint slide, but this is a very incomplete list of some of the programs and projects that initial grant, supplemented by many other grants, allowed the Center for Bioethics to undertake. A few of them are personal favorites for a reason that relate more to the persons than the topics, and I just want to share a few of them with you now. If you think that biobanks is a new topic, it's not. You know, universities and academic centers have been collecting stuff for millennia. And in fact, one of the first NBAC reports was on human biological materials in 1998, and did a rough census and tried to figure out how many fridges there were in the country and what was in them. And of course, nobody knew. I mean, why would you even think that? Nobody knew what its potential was because we had not unleashed the power of genomics to take advantage of the stuff. So a couple of interesting things happened. I'm doing my best not to get a little teary here, but my late colleague, Kim Quaid, was very instrumental in our Center for Bioethics in helping us think through the ethical issues in biobanking. I apologize for maybe you can see it, but among the sort of now so obvious, it's embarrassing to admit, differences between the standard ethical considerations in a clinical trial and the ethical issues in doing research on collected material, we sort of highlighted in a very simple table, including the fact that if you're going to do, you may be able to do research on stuff taken from someone many, many years or decades into the future after they're dead. It completely flipped the research ethics paradigm on its head. What's a human subject? Never mind participant. What does it mean to enroll in a study when you're just allowing diagnostic material to stand collected? Can you withdraw from a study? You know, we had a charming analogy to the song Hotel California, You know, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. You know, once stuff is in the bank, whether the physical material's there and the data has been disseminated, we don't know what the concept of withdrawal means. It's a non-talk. Everything changed. So genomics shifted research ethics paradigms. It shifted clinical paradigms, and Kim certainly wasn't the only people. Another sort of friend of the family that would probably be familiar only to the older folks in the room. This is a picture of Monroe Peacock, who headed the GCRC. We had, I would say, some entertaining discussions about building the biobank here at IU, where our IRB just didn't get it. There's more to that story. Jill will see the next slide that proves that this wasn't a one-shot deal. But the idea of going to an IRB and saying, we don't want to build a biobank. They're like, cool, what's the research question? We don't have a research question. Okay, who are you recruiting? Don't know yet. Like, they're going to be people that come through. Maybe they come through a clinic and they provide some diagnostic material. Maybe they come and voluntarily want to participate. I don't know. Well, what are you going to be studying? Not sure. So when does the study start? It doesn't really start. When does it finish? Can't tell you that either. Can we have approval? They're like, are you crazy? We don't know how to talk. We don't know how to discuss this. And people like Monroe, those of you who knew him, I mean, he didn't take those kinds of rejections lightly. And in a way, he sort of said, all right, I need to bring in the ethics guys and see if we can convince them, like maybe they have some magic ethics words that they, you know, say, and everyone lies down and says, of course, we'll do whatever you want. Hardly, but we eventually sort of, I think, were able to pivot the IRB. This was not a one-shot deal, and it wasn't their fault. This was common to IRBs across in fact, around the world. IRBs built on a model designed to protect human subjects, never mind participants, to protect human subjects from harm was the model. Research was dangerous. Our job is to only allow people into a study when it's so obvious that they will not be harmed, and maybe they'll benefit, but we can't promise them that. That's called treatment. That's our model. That's our philosophic mindset. That lasted from about 1974, when the National Commission produced the Belmont Report that led to the regs, that led to the IRBs. That was unchanged for probably 25 years. So it's a big shift to try, a big sort of shift to try and pivot on its place. But it's because of people like Monroe and Kim that we were able to educate, not scold, not embarrass, but there's a new world out there. The right side of the slide, you'll see another dear friend, Hal Broxmeyer, who was asked, Hal and I were asked at that time, one of, I think, the world's most impressive scientists, certainly that I've ever met, who was asked by Dean Brader with me to produce a report of a task force for establishing an adult stem cell research center. Now, we don't have to go into the genomics or physiology of what adult stem cells are, but this was not a stem cell taken from an embryo that had to be destroyed. You know, skin cell, you were able to do a lot of other kinds of things with stem cells that don't involve the moral quandary of embryos or fetuses. And you can understand, not just because we're in Indiana, everybody was concerned about how one treats this form of human life. Doesn't matter where you are. It makes no sense to try and do something that would be offensive, undignified, unnecessary, a waste. Like, why? When there's another form or another resource that would provide maybe not complete, but certainly sufficient research, here I can say material to do the work. So Hal took time out of his important work with hematopoietic stem cells, and we wrote a report. A report got read, and work continued. So I'm very sort of intrigued by, and I put their pictures here. I mean, I tagged along, and I'm not being, falsely modest. This required the leadership of the medical and scientific community. This was not a bioethics Don Quixote-like activity. I'm coming in, and you must, and here's my windmill. it had to almost come from them, right? Kind of the sweet spot was it's their idea. That will help things. Meanwhile, I was introduced to some pretty impressive people, one of whom is here in the room, Jill, in something that I didn't even understand when it first started. Like, I didn't get this thing. I knew the history, that Connie and Sue Claire and others had related about the NCI meeting in, I forget the year, I don't know, sometime back in the day, when it was stated that, the biggest impediment, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jill, but one of the main impediments to curing breast cancer is we don't know the etiology of normal breast tissue. Like, we don't know what normal is. So if we don't know what normal is, well, we don't know what not normal or abnormal is. So followed by, well, how are you ever going to get that? Like, how are you going to get normal breast tissue? Like, I guess we're going to have a problem with cancer because no woman is going to want to voluntarily allow a 14 gauge needle to be stuck into them for non-diagnostic. Like, that's ridiculous. Gentlemen, imagine a equivalent. Yeah. Enough said. Boy, was I, well, I guess NCI was wrong because of the leadership of these folks and many, many, many others who basically said, you want to bet we can't get women to voluntarily agree to donate tissue? Watch us. I'm not qualified to give you the entire history, but what I can say is that in discussions that a number of us were invited into, with the same kind of Monroe Peacock biobank feel to it, we've got this idea. We want to collect specimens from women. We may use the race, which is a great place, educate, and allow women to make a decision if they'd like to do this. Now, it is research. There's no question it's research. So guess what, IRB? We're coming back to have another conversation with you. If you thought the first one was hard, this one is like, there's living people walking around who are going to be asked if they wish to do this. I wish I could tell a longer story, but what I will say, because the story is legendary, and I've tried to do my best, Jill, whenever I talk about this around the world, to highlight what is particularly unique about this, which was another pivot point in not just genetics, because that's certainly one part of it, but in research ethics generally. Our view was, again, protect, produce a consent form, list a bunch of things, try and discourage people. You don't want everybody to agree. That would almost sound like inducement, because in bioethics, you almost think that if too many people agree to something, you're not giving them sufficient information. We don't know what that number is, but everyone shouldn't agree to participate in research. But we don't know how many fewer than everyone makes it look like we've done a pretty good job of scaring certain people and incentivizing certain people. But to say that this took off is an understatement, including again, these are stories that I remember of volunteers saying, I don't really need the consent form. Like, I want to give of myself. Reasons that had nothing to do with, oh, research is very important, this sort of ephemeral global idea about the importance of research. I'm doing this because I had a mother, sister, daughter, or I know someone who had a mother, sister, daughter. And what really like dropped me to tears was seeing the journal entries that they would, or not journal, I guess it was like a journal entry. This is why I'm doing this. So it was almost like the reverse. I'm telling you why I want to do this, not you giving me information and I'm going to agree to come into your study. The goal was to fill up this bank as quickly as possible and deplete it as quickly as possible. This wasn't about commercialization. It was get the stuff out to the world as quickly as possible. We want to cure breast cancer. My friend Peter Singer, who was until recently the special advisor to Dr. Tedros at WHO, has been writing some nice blogs lately, and one of them is about how the SDGs are just not really working. The Sustainable Development Goals are just, we're not getting there. And Peter has said his new model is, we forget SDGs, we should do GSDs, get shit done. Like enough with the planning, enough with the thinking and the meetings and the photo ops, and let's have a meeting to talk about the meeting and the next meeting. It's like, we got stuff to do, let's do it. And in a way, Komen for me, way before any of this model was, I know it's being recorded, and if those online are offended by me saying shit, like, too bad. Like Komen was getting shit done, thank you, before other people were. It's a very interesting model. Other things we did at the Center for Bioethics, you don't have to read all these, but we were talking about predictive health. We had a program that, and among the admitted failures that I will own up to is I really suck at coming up with acronyms. I know it's a special skill that Tierney's got, and I'm sure others have. I just can't do it. So we came up with this thing called predictive health ethics research and called it Predictor. It's like, anyway, Fairbanks gave us a chunk of money. We started to do work on topics back then, which are the same topics today, just with different emphasis. Another kind of tearjerker here, Personalized Medicine Institute that our dear friend David Flockhart started. That's Barbara Evans, our friend who was with us for a few years and then moved to Houston and University of Florida, one of the world's polymaths in engineering, law, ethics, and regulation. I just have a couple of screenshots, and I included Peter, not because he introduced me, but Peter was a leader before anyone else was in thinking about how to take information to take data and apply it to patient care. Not just the evidence-based medicine stuff, that's charming, but to really look at how do people understand risk. Great topic. We don't spend enough time thinking about it. If you're wondering why there's a refrigerator on the slide, the reason is that Barbara came up with the best analogy of all time and recognized after doing a fairly good pharmacoeconomic analysis that only about 2/3 of drugs work as planned, like for the thing that they should happen. And among the third that don't, a bunch just like they don't work. Like, okay, they don't work. A much smaller version of that, about 7%, actually harm. And then a little tiny part like kill you. Now that's, with the math at that time was, many hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on drugs that actually don't work. Never mind the ones that harm. But if you just look at the ones that harm, 7% is a big number. And the analogy became, if 7% of refrigerators failed, wouldn't you be concerned about those refrigerators? I mean, yes, we have warranties, so you can get your refrigerator fixed, or maybe buy a new refrigerator if it's a lemon. But 7% is a lot. Never mind if they fell over and killed you. That's a different problem. So Barbara came up with quite an inventive new legal theory about what it would mean if medicine guaranteed that what they were doing would work. That was the promise of personalized medicine. Right drug, right time, right person, right reason. What if we moved that one step further and said, I'm going to test you first to make sure that you do respond to this, and then I'm going to guarantee you'll. That's so bizarre in medicine and nursing and health. We would never utter those words, guarantee. Those are some of the experimental ideas we worked on. All of the only point of this slide is to say that there are a few of us who started to get a little nervous about all the genomic hype. Like, we're saying it's great, there's going to be cures, they're coming, they're on their way, where are they? This was a paper 10 years, written 10 years after that White House event, where some colleagues of mine and I said, maybe we should pump the brakes a little. Like, because if the public starts to get too excited and then we don't deliver, there'll be a real whiplash. People will withdraw their trust, stop supporting science, and we don't want that to happen. Okay, just quickly on to the future, and we can have some, if we have time for a couple of questions. Pick your favorite quote here. One is from our friend Howard Brody, who wrote a book that's on the shelf in the Center for Bioethics, who said back in 2009, I don't think bioethics should spend much time thinking about genetics. Like, what more is there to say? Read the book, you'll see. Do we need to use bioethics anymore? It's pretty much a regulatory problem. Like, don't worry about it. The better quote, of course, is "The future ain't what it used to be," which is Yogi Berra. In which case, this slide is just simply meant to capture a selection of what has been happening. And I have 3 slides. I'll just go through them very quickly. First of all, genomics is big business. And that's not even a really good slide. It's one of 50,000 slides that you could pick that shows lots of people are spending more money and there's a big payoff at the end. The top right is showing what we all know, not only about Moore's law, but we know how genomic large-scale sequencing and whole genome sequencing, the price is going down and down and down. And, eventually it'll hit a number like buying licorice in the store. But that is a non-trivial matter when the price of doing something becomes not only a non-issue, it sort of opens up the world to, I don't mean bad actors, but it just democratizes much more. Quite an interesting phenomenon. The left bottom is the Neanderthal genome story, which is quite interesting. And the right is the extinct African gazelle that has just been, whose genome has just been sequenced, bringing back extinct species. These two sort of remind me of entertaining bioethics, kind of what happened with 23andMe and a few of the other OTCs. That's interesting. That's curious. Not sure what we're going to do with that, but interesting. Lots of other things going on. Not enough time to go through all of them. Biodigital convergence is my favorite, which is where you start to actually combine genomes of human and animal. There's an awful lot of work going on at the OECD and elsewhere about the convergence of many technologies. It's no longer siloed technologies. CRISPR, gene drive, public health genomics, polygenic risk scores, synthetic biology, the list goes on. Bill Tierney and I just came back from Puebla in Mexico, where the day after I returned, Nature spent a good chunk of their issue talking about the Mexican genome and Mexican genomics. This is simply a photo of something that represents something much larger, and that countries are now engaged in this as a matter of domestic S&T and R&D. Mexico, Estonia, Iceland. This is no longer the small group of 4 or 5 countries that mapped and sequenced the genome, the US, the UK, Japan, and a couple of others. This is now a global activity. I'm very proud of the fact that Canada spent some very important intellectual capital, first during SARS and then during COVID-19, to map and sequence first the coronavirus and SARS, and then the host and virus sequence for many of the COVID-2 genomes, done by collaboration, cooperation, lowering the barriers to peer review, lowering the barriers to funding. Like, how much do you need? When can we get this done? So it's interesting how science can serve as a mover or a lowerer of barriers that society has put up. And I just put the public health genomics paper screenshot here, because let us not forget that this isn't simply about clinical care. There's a way of implicating genomics in public health. I don't need to say anything more about this topic. That's why I made it as big as I could. It's everything. I had a fun chat at Lilly yesterday. Tell you more about it another time. And then I'll just remind you that because my journey has been one that spent a lot of time in policy land, sort of out of the clinic, even out of the university, this is that should say tools of policy and governance have evolved. Again, massive toolbox, more things there, more things than exist on this slide. And I happen to believe that the choice of the right tool at the right time for the right reason is as much a moral issue as which drug you should be prescribing, and lots more to be said about that. We've watched how gene editing is the subject of one of those, and I'm going to close with this reminder, which may be just a little too cute by half, that I've become convinced. This is a screenshot of some work that a friend of mine, Alessandro Blasime from ETH in Zurich, and I've been working on. that kind of reminds us that some of this has nothing to do with science at all. You know, how we spend money on genomics, how we spend money on this or that. It's actually about social policy. And the problem with social policy decisions is that we don't even agree on what we agree on, particularly in what we call liberal democracies, because we don't have a good. This gets back to your deliberation stuff, Peter. We just don't have good ways of deciding how to decide when people disagree about priorities. So, since we're talking about genomics, this is what I call my IU-OM. I hope you don't mind the effort to construct a new omic. You will see many of the same faces that I mentioned earlier. You should know that I saw Pat Lair at the airport when I came here on the way to Dakar for a meeting. He arrived safely, in case you're wondering. And I showed him this slide. I hope he's listening to this talk. I showed him the slide. I said, Pat, I really wanted you to know that you matter a lot to me. And first thing he said to me is, how come my picture is so small? Can you make my picture? And if you know Pat Lair, can you make my picture bigger? No, actually, can you get rid of all the other pictures and just put my picture there? Rich, if I knew you were coming, your picture would be here in a hall of honor. I won't go through all the names, but these are people that have helped me with my own journey. And then we don't have time, but the name of this topic of this lecture was, where have the genomics gone, or where will genomics go in the future? And if we had time, I was going to lead a sing-along to where have all the flowers gone. I'll just leave that up there, and you can hum it in your own mind. Thank you very much.
So one thing we can do is people who need to go. So
if you need to go, please go. If you need to stay, please stay.
2 minutes.
Sure.
Stay there online.
Yeah. Sorry, I went a bit longer, but that shouldn't have surprised anybody. Rob Katz.
There be reception?
I don't know.
But you can repeat the question when they're a good question.
Yeah. I would love to have something with you. That's the only question we got. Thank you, Peter.
Eric, you said something about, you didn't talk about regulation, height. You didn't even mention COVID, which you may have heard about. It was this little thing that happened the last couple of years. How did your view of ethics and thinking about science change, if at all? Can you repeat that question?
How has COVID changed, if it has, my view about ethics and science and how we respond? And the answer is, in some ways, quite a bit. And in other ways, not so much, for the reason that I said earlier about the lesson learned problem. COVID, on the one hand, can be seen as yet another public health emergency of international concern. We've had a bunch of them. We've actually been through a bunch of pandemics. This is not the first one we've ever seen. And somehow, magically, we either have amnesia or we truly don't get it. So that's one part. The thing that I believe that COVID has exposed in bioethics.
Turn to me. Turn to me, say it. Without looking devilish. Good.
Is nothing if not subtle, right? It's exposed what I would say has been maybe a well-kept secret, not sure, in bioethics. And this is where I'm going to go, and I don't mind if it sort of offends some of my colleagues in the field. We like congratulating ourselves about how smart we are and our ability to figure out why this problem is a problem. We're very good at being house inspectors. We can find a flaw in your argument. We can find a weakness. We can find a wormhole. We can sometimes find solutions, and we do it because we're not allowed to touch anything. We're not, those of us who are not clinicians. So we have to use our head. And in the course of that, on the one hand, legitimacy, I'm in the room. Like, I'm one of the 6 components. I'm not just furniture. So my contribution is my brain and my thinking, and it needs to be received. I don't think we have been as nimble in the field of bioethics as we should be or could be. And what COVID has done, for me at least, is it has exposed some of the weaknesses, not only in the broad field of bioethics, but in the way that it can most effectively engage and help policy. What's an example? Well, in Canada, the vast majority of people who died from COVID died in nursing homes. Nursing homes are one of the areas that are not regulated under Canadian health policy. You think we have national health care. We don't. We actually have a federal government that provides a set of standards that each of the 10 provinces and the 3 territories are expected to follow if they want to get a bit of federal funding. But we really have 13 healthcare systems. We don't have 2,000 of them, but we have 13. They don't all think about healthcare in the same way. They decide how they're going to spend their provincial budgets beyond the requirements of ensuring equitable access to care. And what I think the COVID story exposed for us was how, it's too cute to say social justice issues, but how issues of community and access to a healthcare system that claims that it is helping didn't work. Like we said, oh, that's terrible that all these older people died in nursing homes. That was really terrible. We should do something about that. And I think that the way you care for the most vulnerable in your community is evidence of what your moral concern is generally. And I can't think of people more vulnerable or more in need of our care, hope, respect than those who are in those facilities, let alone our Indigenous population. And we have 3 large kinds of groups. We have First Nations people, we have Métis, and we have Inuit, who are also among the least well off. I mean, there's still, at last count, maybe 24 boil water advisories in Canada on reserves. You call them reservation, call them reserves.
Let's take 2 more questions with short answers, Eric.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
I'll try and make it a quick answer, apparently.
So, I thought the way that you ended was really powerful with the idea, with the problem of pluralism. And the COVID question made me think kind of along these lines too, and the difference between, say, public health ethics and ethics in a clinic, where you have more of a chance to tailor individual care to the individual values. But when you're working at a public health or national level, you don't have that same power. One thing I would love to hear your thoughts on is I've noticed a shift in the way that people are thinking about genetics, which, as you mentioned throughout your entire talk, there are still like very pluralistic attitudes towards how people should approach genetic medicine. Since that is individual, but because policies like ACMG's policies about mandatory testing or analysis affect a much larger population, where do you see that going? How do you see that?
So it's a great question, and I will keep it brief.
And you repeat it though, which is also.
Oh, I do?
Because we don't have a microphone on.
Okay. Such a good question. How do I see the connection, if at all, between the way that genetics is both a clinical field and a community field, in the sense that you can tailor medicines to people, but you're also part of a population, and public health issues? If I didn't do that so well, I can still give the answer that sounds like, I mean, I heard what you said, but I'm not really good at getting short phrases for a grant, and I'm really not good at summarizing, apparently. And by the way, are you humming in the back of your mind? I really hope you're trying to do this, because I have spent a lot of time working on this. The short answer is, I think that the public health ethics area of scholarship and application is the most needy of some disruption, because we know that the public doesn't understand public health. Like, they don't get it. When it works perfectly, it's invisible. Like, the water is clean. There is no salmonella in the salad bars, and everyone's been vaccinated, and it's fine. And unfortunately, public health is one of those things that you notice it when it's not working. And I think that's a non-trivial problem with the translation of its value to the public. It's what led, in many ways, and Canada was not immune to, the misinformation and disinformation campaign that CCA documented, and many others. People that would have lived, numbers that would have lived if they had been vaccinated. And not because they weren't able to be, but they mistakenly believed something that they read that led them to conclude that they shouldn't get vaccinated. It wasn't a rational choice. Some people may even wish to choose not to do so. Okay, I mean, I'm not a big fan of making that decision, but for those thousands, and we had thousands, we had a great uptake, you know, almost all Canadians had 3 shots. Good. Far better than US data, but the data of who didn't and why is troubling. And I think it's a huge opportunity for bioethics and policy to get together. I don't want to be really controversial on my last comment, but honestly, maybe we should stop calling it bioethics. I mean, because I think that scares people.
Okay, we stop. Talk's over.
On the other hand,
One more question.
or
there are chat questions.
okay, how do I do the?
One last question. Pick the best one.
There's no chat question.
Okay.
Comment, but I do have a question.
Oh,
Let me do Matt, and then
Matt.
you. Matt.
I think there could be some tension between how genomics is applied and the concept of personalized medicine. I think we see so far is things like in Mexico or by race or by some other grouping, we investigate genomics and we say, oh, well, there's a disproportionate amount of something in this population. And then we draw the conclusion that it applies to that population, but it's really probably only 40% of that population or something like that. So then when you make the implications of that, you know, 60% are going to not get the right medicine for them, or even if it's flip-flop, it's still a huge chunk. How do we balance that? That's what I've seen.
Yeah, and I'll do the real short version. And honestly, we've done work on this with colleagues in the UK on the words that we use actually matter. There is a difference when you ask people what they know about population health versus public health. It sounds strange. These are 2 different worlds for them. And legitimately they are, but it's like saying experiment versus research causes very different reactions when you ask people whether they support or under. That's at the public level. I think the same thing is happening with not all due respect, because it's not about you, to our politicians who really don't understand in many instances the nuance of what the goals of science might be, where on the one hand, the idea of curiosity-driven research, which is absolutely critical, is really appears to be fighting with outcomes research. Show me what you're going to do. Show me how it's going to help, including the much appreciated case that was made to the Lilly Endowment, which is, yes, this is about research, but it's really more about how we're going to help Hoosiers. Like that's both are true. And I think it's the ability to hold 2 truths at the same time that will help make that case. But I can tell you that it's so easy to fall back. I feel that it's easy to fall back into the old rhetoric of identifying people with disease or geography with disease. I mean, remember what happened with AIDS in the very early years. If you are from Haiti, like what? So we have an old set of tools in discrimination, in human rights, that we probably need to dust off a little bit. The closer we get into the public health, population health, public health, genomics, when we start going there, you know, the autonomy flag should just sort of be set down for a moment. Just leave it on the side and start thinking about what collective decision-making looks like. Is that good enough?
That's perfect. Great.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you so much. Any further questions, come and grab Eric, of course, and we'll see you all.
Thank you all for coming.